So good morning, everyone. My talk is on cybersecurity and digital evidence. This is a project at the very beginning phase that my PhD student and I are working on right now. But to give you some background, collecting evidence back in the day seems really straightforward. If you're working in criminal justice system, you go into a crime scene. There's physical evidence that you can collect: fingerprints, DNA, shoe marks, tire track if it's outdoor, things like that. But as technology gets integrated into our everyday space, it becomes trickier for criminal justice system actors to collect the right evidence, to process them, etc. So here are just some example, right? Now you have smart hotels. Everything can be connected to your phone, which means that if there is a crime scene in there, we might have to locate phones, we might have to get all the data that is in the room, whatever system they have. And if it is like in the living room, not only do you have to think about the computers there, but you might have to think about gathering the game console, things like that.
Smart cheese setup.
So we will need to then identify devices that may contain any sort of digital evidence at the crime scene or scene of incident. What this means, though, is that it used to be more straightforward, but it's now becoming more complicated with the increased number of devices that people own nowadays, right? Smartphones, IoT devices, smartwatches, which sometimes have been great in some cases where they could actually prove that the suspect is indeed lying. Like their phone, their smartwatch show that they were at the crime scene at the time of the crime. But at the same time, you will then have to collect all of those evidence and sift through the amount of data in order to find that information, that one piece of information that might be key to a case. Same thing, now we have Ring camera. Those are also generating data that can be used or have uses in criminal and civil cases. So this means that there's an increased prevalence of digital evidence, both in criminal and civil cases. In the past, a lot of the talk about digital evidence, digital forensics focuses only on cybercrime, but increasingly they play a role in more traditional crime as well. I mean, you have people videotaping themselves, sometimes committing crime. You have people doing, using TikTok to live stream, maybe at a protest, things like that. So there's increasingly a lot of digital traces and evidence that gets into the criminal justice system. So before I go on to what are the implications, this is just a brief definition of what digital evidence and digital forensic is. So digital evidence is simply any evidence that consists of information stored or transmitted in an electronic form. So, I talk about IoT devices, smartwatches, but your CCTV camera technically is considered digital evidence as well. But those form of data has been used the criminal justice system is more familiar with those sort of digital evidence versus the newer form of mobile devices, IoT devices, etc. And digital forensic is simply a branch of forensic science that focuses on identifying, acquiring, analyzing, and reporting on those data that are stored electronically. And that definition is taken from the Interpol. So what does this mean for the criminal justice system? Well, several things, right? So what my PhD student and I are working on is actually looking at the court system and how digital evidence kind of plays into that with the different stakeholders that are involved. And we chose to look at the court system because there are so many different actors that are involved. You have judges, prosecutors, defense attorneys, jurors if it goes to a trial, and witnesses. In this case, it could be normal witnesses as well as expert witnesses. And in this process, there's different tasks that are involved, right, with digital evidence. So imagine, if we go back, think about the crime scene that I've shown earlier. You're dealing potentially with gigabytes, terabytes of data for a case. And then the different prosecutors will have to work with labs or law enforcement to process the data, analyze it, search through it. Defense attorney have to do the same as well to try to find potential key evidence that they can build their case on. And then the jurors and expert witnesses will have to focus on how to present these information so that it makes sense to a layperson. So there's a lot of issues involved, and there's currently not a lot of statistics or studies that look at how digital evidence play a role in the courtroom specifically. We have no idea how, whether if we present a mobile, key, let's say key text messages from a mobile device in a court case, would that change the juror's decision about a case? We have no idea. We also don't know how prosecutors and defense attorneys select expert witness as well. So in the US, there are multiple organizations that provide certificates for digital forensic analysts. We don't really know how they go about actually selecting expert witness for the case. So this is what my PhD student and I will be looking at. Is we plan on creating a survey to send to lawyers and to ask them about how they select digital evidence, based on the amount of data that they have. Thank you. And how they build their cases and how they select expert witness. So these are some of the questions and things that we're trying to understand so that we can come up with best practices and guidance for lawyers as well, hopefully to help them have a way to, or have a guideline so they can more properly select expert witnesses or how to approach the amount of digital evidence that they have to deal with nowadays. So thank you for listening. If you have any question or feedback, you can reach me at the email address. Thank you. And that is my cat. It's not just a random cat.
Very cute.
You have to introduce the cat. What's the cat's name?
Toffee?
And what breed of cat is it?
I don't know. She's a rescue.
Poodle 134.
Siamese 456.
There we go.
Hello everyone, good morning. I am Manila. I am a graduate student from University of Utah. Today I will be presenting on users' preference and understanding of smartphone permission settings. Why smartphone permission settings? We store a lot of critical information today on smartphones, from credit card information, important files, your passwords, your contacts, everything. And permission settings are the primary way you manage your privacy on smartphones. Let's have a look at the permission manager on iOS and Android. When we had a look at this, we observed a couple of important things. One, there are a lot of permission settings, and the way they are arranged and shown to the user is pretty static. It's the same for every user. And of all of these permission settings, how many of them are actually being used or considered useful by the users? And that's the second question. And thirdly, and most importantly, do users even understand what these permission settings mean? So all of this led us to question, how do users perceive smartphone permission settings? We are conducting a survey. This is an ongoing research to understand their preferences and how do they understand permission settings. To begin with, we combined the permission settings on both of them into a final list. As we see here, there are a couple of overlaps, like location, contacts, and there were a lot of them. This is just a small version of it. We combined them into one of it, but with the ones which were explicit and exclusive for operating system, we kept it as is. iOS has a total of 20 permission settings, Android has 16, and our final list had 28 permission settings. In our survey, we asked them to rate and rank to show their preferences. For the rating, we give an importance scale. Along with the importance scale, we also give another scale called as I do not know this setting to understand how much unaware are they about the setting. When they rank the 5 most important and the 5 least important settings. Sure, they rank a certain way, but we wanted to understand why they rank, why is it important to them. Of the 5 of them, we ask 3 most important and 3 less important. Why is a particular permission setting important to them? Lastly, we ask what do they understand a permission setting controls, to understand if, to show a gap if there is a difference between what they are understanding to what it actually does on the other side. All of this also doesn't mean there has not been any updates in Android and iOS. These are the latest updates. The Android provides you a new interface called as Privacy Dashboard, where they prioritize location, camera, microphone. This is according to the literature review, where location, camera, and microphone for a long time has been considered very, very important. But probably our research would show otherwise as well. The preliminary results also show they prioritize files and folders where they store important files. The second update that I want to show is the unused applications. Android automatically removes all of the permissions, and in fact the temporary files that you store as a part of the applications if you're not using them. And iOS provides application privacy report where you can see which were the updated permissions that were used by these applications. Sure, these exist, but what we want to understand through the survey is, do users know about these and what do they feel about these? So these are included in the survey. And this is something that I included after I heard Stuart talk yesterday about the security backlash. This was a common Reddit community who did not like the automatic removal. Sure, I'm a huge fan of this because if I'm not using it, I want them to be removed. But a lot of them did not want it. And also, the usability of removal is very, very hard. You have to go into each application, you have to remove it one by one if you don't want it to be automatically removed. This is like I said, this is an ongoing work. The internet contributions are how do users understand a permission setting does to what it actually does. And secondly, how does their preference vary? Can we group them into clusters and can we personalize a UI according to their usage? And lastly, how do socioeconomic factors influence their preferences and understanding? Since I do have time, I do want to touch upon one of the challenges we're facing is we have a lot of text box questions and a lot of participants are using LLMs. I am currently manually checking it and rejecting the workers who are using LLMs. But if any of you have had a better solution for technically using any tools to identify the LLM usage or in general to better do this, but yeah, I would love to hear from you. Thank you guys.
All right. Thanks for having me here for the second time at an SHB workshop. I'm actually educated and trained as a geographer, but for the last couple of years I've been working in Zina's working group and now doing my postdoc there. We are doing currently a small qualitative study about the spatial digital safety strategies of at-risk users. I'm a geographer, so I think about location. What interests me, I can maybe start with something that happened exactly 11 years ago. You're all familiar with this. It was in June 2013. Actually 6th of June, so tomorrow it will be 11 years that actually Edward Snowden met Glenn Greenwald, who was still a person then Laura Poitras, and met in the hotel room. And what they did is the first thing they did is they went to the fridge and put their cell phones in, took the batteries out and put the cell phones in. And so in preparation to today, I realized there's a huge conversation about why did they do that, and is it a Faraday cage? Is it about making it soundproof? So there's all these debates about why they did that. What I think is interesting in this moment is actually that there's changing the spatial characteristics of a particular place. And I think that's the lens that interests me in that very moment. And so the concern actually is that something is changing in the way that spaces are and look, and they make things for some people more difficult. The concern actually, though, is quite old. When we think about how Frank Church used this, I did my own redaction and cutting out everything that's American, because I think the concern is actually related to everybody. So the government has perfected a technological capability that enables us to monitor the messages that go through the air. That capability at any time could be turned around on people, and no one would have any privacy left. Such is the capability to monitor everything. There would be no place to hide. And I think this is interesting. As a geographer, it's interesting to me talking about place here. What is it about place that is changing that makes some things for some people more difficult? And what happened since then, actually, so this is an old concern. What happened since then is actually the rise in mobile phones. So around the year 2010, it was actually more mobile phones than people in most countries. Of course, then the rise of smart environments generally, wearables, and of course now also how does AI relate to this and what does it do to particular spaces. So we have all these new challenges emerging, and the question is, how does that go with people? And you can think of Ed Snowden as one of a very high-risk user, but how does that sit with at-risk users actually? And so we started basically having this qualitative study, interview study, where we asked, I mean, the details are not so important, but this is just to show that we had a semi-structured interview with people, and starting with a couple of opening questions. And we asked them about how they think about their IT security. We asked them about what assets and data are worth protecting. And most people then actually already mentioned, okay, it's actually my location data that is very important to me. And this is the moment that we jump on, because I think this is of interest. And we asked them then specifically, okay, what are the geolocation risks and where do they occur? I mean, what spaces are critical that you need to negotiate and change maybe your behaviors? So there are spaces of risk, but also spaces of protection. So what are the spaces that one moves through that are actually quite safe still? And what are the protective measures that you can implement? And so in light of all this, in light of ever more smartification, we asked, this is sort of our research question, we asked how do at-risk users actually perceive the emerging digital safety challenges, especially the constant risk of geolocation. And so we had first couple of interviews with climate activists, journalists, but also democracy activists. And there's, I think, a new emerging focus for me in my research that I'm focusing on democracy activists, especially those who are sort of caught up in geopolitical confrontations. And here, some of the first results in our interviews are actually, they confirm at least sort of our initial suspicion, is that some people are very concerned and try to adapt, and one way of doing so is actually choosing providers. One concrete example is I would rather trust this kind of big company like Google or Apple. I mean, maybe the US government is also spying on me, but what would be worse? Being spied on by the Chinese or by the Americans. So what is interesting here is that, of course, these answers also differ depending on the threat model. So it depends on whom you talk to and what kind of threat model is in place, and then you could maybe end up with very different answers about providers. The point is that providers do play a role. So it matters to people whose service they're using. The other thing is they want to manage location data, and there are of course unknown unknowns. There are things that they don't know, and they don't even have that question, but there are also known unknowns, meaning they also have realized that they know way too little, and this is also part what's in we just confirm here what's actually also in the at-risk user literature, is that they have less digital safety knowledge than they actually need. All interviews of their own accord, we didn't ask for it, that they mentioned the word paranoia in some instance. And that was interesting to us because I think it speaks to the fact that they have less knowledge, that there's known unknowns, and they don't quite know how to navigate them in environments and contexts that are now highly technologized. They have, Becky Kazansky calls this anticipatory data practices. So thinking about the future, what kind of data would cause problems in the future? And what we then actually realized is that there's also, of course, with this question of managing location data, it also feeds back into the present and how people behave. So this is not just related to the future, but also plays out in space and how people move through and about space. For example, there was often a clear distinction between private and activist professional phones. Some people use foreign SIM cards or leaving phones at home when they go to a particular action. There's, of course, the impulse to actually have or control control their surroundings. So interviews habitually, it's really a habit in the sense that people have repeatedly referred to this and how they think about it in their everyday life, is they habitually think about where their devices are located. They make an effort of sometimes banning devices from certain areas, meaning from some domestic spaces or during meetings with other at-risk users. So you think actively about what kind of digital devices you carry, you have with you, you have in the room. And there's also then the problem of avoiding spaces where control is not possible. So when you can't control your environment, for example, in public spaces, then you might not actually go into those spaces. And so this has a couple of analytical implications. I'll use the last 30 seconds for this, which is there is for them a question of data-rich versus data-poor environment. So I call this UBICOM, that you name it, pervasive computing, smartified environments. So this is the one end of the spectrum. And the other end of the spectrum is maybe something that you can call digital deserts. They can be self-made or imposed. We can think of a self-made digital desert when people banning their devices from their rooms that they don't want to have their devices around. But there's also imposed ones. If you, for example, think of internet shutdowns, then this is actually a question of who controls that environment to actually make an environment data poor again. And there's the question of private versus public spaces, because it matters, because it changes users' ability to control their environment. If you're in a public space, then it gets much harder to actually, if there's CCTV or if there's smart public transit, then it gets much harder to actually say, okay, you have to either avoid, you make choices about that, but you can't really control that environment. And there's, of course, then also the question of differential access to resources in those environments. At home, you can install an extra firewall. That's not possible on a public Wi-Fi. So I think how we think about spaces actually matters in terms of the kind of risk that people are exposed to. Yeah, thank you.
We're the only one here.
Thank you all. I'm Richard John from the University of Southern California. My training is in quantitative methods and computational psychology, although a lot of my research is in risk and decision analysis. And for the last 20 years, I've been working with the Center for Risk and Economic Analysis of Threats and Emergencies at USC, the first research center set up by Congress after 9/11. Now they're all over. CREATE is still around, although we're not one of the active. We're an emeritus center that works off of grants and contracts. One of the greatest things about SHB every year, and I remember the first two SHBs, which were right down the road at MIT, is that we have people from lots of different areas, and I see that this is almost a real conference because we're all sort of talking about a topic that's sort of integrated. And so this is a little bit different. This is a little bit different topic. I was tempted to talk about some of the work I've been doing on interventions to help people with truth discernment. And instead I decided to talk about something completely different. This is work with Ayman, who's a student of mine at USC. And it looks at moral foundations of the armed conflict, specifically in the Ukraine. This is something we're all aware of. It's an ongoing escalation of a conflict since 2014. And our objective in this was to really better understand how people from all over the world view the conflict, how they conceptualize and frame the conflict. And we have data from the first 36 weeks following the invasion. This is Twitter data, data from X. And I want to emphasize we focus on the language that they're using and the way they frame it morally. It's not a topical analysis. It's not a sentiment analysis, although we're currently doing a sentiment analysis on that data. And it's not an analysis of misinformation. How many of you have heard of moral foundations theory? Okay, so this will be a little bit of a tutorial. Others have published some research on the war using Twitter data. I'll just mention those. Moral foundations theory is work that Haidt did about 20 years ago. I think he's still at NYU, perhaps. And I got familiar with it because one of his students, Jesse Graham, came to USC. And I have colleagues, he and Morteza Dagani, who work in this area. And I got interested in this. I'm computationally always interested in things like this. So a couple of propositions in MFT that I think are central to this study. Intuitions come first, and there are many psychological foundations of morality. So Okay, we want to capture these visceral, intuitive reactions to the war, not specifically about information or things like that. Okay, so we're using this moral lens, and as I mentioned, we're looking at people all over the world. And the 5 components of MFT that we focus on, which are, I think it's grown to 6 more recently, but right now, care, harm, fairness, loyalty, also sometimes known as in-group, authority, and sanctity or purity. And so just to review, care is sensitivity to suffering and empathizing with others. Fairness is justice, equality, reciprocity. Loyalty is this in-group orientation, authority, valuing tradition, social order, respecting power. And purity is sensitivity to discuss cultural sacredness. A lot of research, a lot of popular research is focused on the notion that liberals typically focus on the first 2 of these foundations, whereas conservatives are much more focused on the last 3. So they conceptualize things in terms of, conservatives do loyalty, authority, and purity, whereas liberals in terms of care, harm, and fairness. So this is a list of our aims. I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. We got 36 weeks of English language tweets. We looked at 31 countries, including the United States, Ukraine, and Russia, and 28 countries that are now in NATO, 14 of which were there before the Cold War ended, and 14 of which have been added since, and we differentiate those 2 groups. Apologies for combining all of the Western European countries together. But then again, we typically combine all the states in the United States. And I can't think of anything more different than California, and we were talking about Western Louisiana. I'm from Louisiana originally, and so I can't. It's got to be at least as different as 2 countries in Western Europe. Okay, so collected the tweets. We used software called Luke, Linguistic Inquiry and Word Count. And essentially, there's dictionaries for the moral foundations in Luke, and then we conducted this statistical analysis. We filtered on words like Russia, Ukraine, Putin, Zelensky, Russian, invasion, war, Kyiv, and another spelling of Kyiv, and Ukrainian. We randomly sampled 1,000 tweets and then actually looked at those carefully to see how many of those were about the war. About 97% were, so we figured that was pretty good. These are the NATO countries. I think probably all those countries. This is the data, about a little over 700,000 tweets from the US, and only about 10,000 tweets from Russia. And of course, that's partly because it's English language, and that's one of the limitations. These are the seed words. These are the standard words that are in Luke. This is a plot of the number of tweets over time. You can see it peaked right after the invasion. It starts in early February. The invasion was on February 22nd. And then it flattens out pretty much. This is US and early NATO members, and this is everybody else. Russia, of course, is the lowest here. Ukraine pretty much tracks the post-Cold War members of NATO. And so this is the main slide. You can see here that loyalty, most of the tweets are about loyalty, and there's very little about fairness. At one point we titled this, I have a paper that's on the website for SHB called All's Fair in Love and War. And basically, this was presented at Hicks, it's a proceedings paper. And the fairness is very low. People don't conceptualize anything in terms of fairness or unfairness about the attack. It's mostly in terms of loyalty, which is a more conservative leaning thing. And of course, the vice is the opposite end, so there's not a whole lot about loyalty in that, or fairness, but a lot about care, which is suffering and harm, the opposite of harm. So this is over time. I'm not going to go through those plots. So yeah, as I mentioned, the conflict is mostly conceptualized in terms of loyalty, and to some extent in terms of care, little expression of fairness concerns. Yeah, I'm out of time. Yeah, obviously we only have English language tweets, so that's an issue. Restricted first 36 weeks following the Russian invasion. Basically, the first 36 weeks before Elon Musk took over, and we lost our access to the data. But we still got 1.1 billion tweets before that. And I can't share any of the tweets because of the agreement we have. And as I mentioned, Germany is grouped with the early NATO countries, even though half of Germany, or a portion of Germany, was actually with the other NATO countries historically. Okay, future directions, and that's it. Thank you.
Really related topic. So we can discuss about the Ukraine.
There's paper.
Yeah.
And so we can talk.
Alright, I am Allison McDonald. I'm at Boston University, just across the river. I'm presenting some work I did with my colleague Catherine Caduto about how people manage their shared sexual content when they break up with someone. So the definition we're using for sexting is probably the one you expect. It's just any sort of exchange, sending or receiving of explicit messages. This is including text-based photos and videos. And there are different studies that estimate how many people, like adults in the United States, are sexting, but the estimates are pretty standard, pretty typically high, so somewhere between 50 and 80% of adults. So lots of people are sexting, and generally this is actually a good thing. There's lots of research that talks about how sexting can be good for self-esteem, can provide sexual gratification, can help people strengthen their intimate relationships that they're trying to develop, can help people learn about their sexual preferences, and so on. So generally, this is a good thing, but not every relationship obviously lasts, and as Lucy gave a really nice overview yesterday, there are lots of risks that can happen with this kind of content if the person who has it is no longer trustworthy, right? And so we were thinking about this sort of like moment of breakup as a possible point at which you're transitioning from having your content being sort of held by someone you hopefully trusted to it being in the possession of someone you maybe don't trust anymore, right? And obviously many relationships end very amicably and lots of people will have no malicious intent. But even if you're not worried about someone distributing your content or doing something nasty with it, you might just not want them to see you naked anymore, which is also legitimate. So we're sort of thinking about what people want to happen to that content when they go through a breakup. And one of the sort of like motivators for this work, especially in the broader context of avoiding intimate image abuse, is that I think we need to think about how people are using these tools when they don't expect to need protective mechanisms in order to build something that sort of integrates these tools in a way that they're there when they need them, but they didn't realize that they had them. So that people, for example, don't feel like using some like particularly strong or secure tool is some signal to their partner that they don't trust them or that they expect the relationship is about to end. And also because if you really do trust your partner, you maybe just don't think you need them. So if we can like sneak them into tools so that people think that they're just like normal and they don't realize that they're until they need them, that'd be great. So we conducted a mixed method survey with US adults who were sexting. We asked about what they wanted to happen to their intimate content when they broke up with someone, as well as what they themselves planned to do or expected they would do with their partner's content. We asked them whether they were talking to their partner about these preferences. And then we also asked them some questions about how they felt about co-created content. So this is something that like might have been like a photo taken during in-person sexual contact that is interesting because they themselves might not actually have possession of it and may also not have technically like copyright over, which is a common mechanism for taking down non-consensually distributed images. So a couple of highlights.
this is consistent with prior work. People are sexting where they're already chatting. Most people are just on SMS or Facebook Messenger. Folks use dating applications as well. Fairly low numbers for people using encrypted applications. Most people also are saving sex, and in the context of our study, most of the people we talked to were in romantic relationships where this was something that was probably considered appropriate. They were downloading things sort of with the expectation that their partner was doing the same. But we sort of saw these two ways that people ended up saving them, right? So lots of people actually were taking active, like proactive actions. They were downloading the images, saving them in camera roll or in a locked folder. And then just over 10% of people weren't doing any of this, but they were saying, like, I still have access to these photos because they're in my chat history. So even though they weren't doing any sort of like proactive action to keep track of this content, they still had access to it. Okay, so we asked people, what do you want to happen? Like, what do you hope your ex does if you break up with someone? And this was surprising to me. Only about 50% of people said that they wanted their ex to delete the content. Everyone else was sort of distributed. They could answer multiple things here, but our participants, lots of them, about a quarter of them didn't care, so they can do whatever they want. I've already sent the photos; it's theirs now. Lots of people wanted to have discussions about it, and then over 10% of people said, "I actually hope that they keep that." One example of that is one of our participants was like, I hope that they keep it and remember what they're missing. So this sort of suggests to us that there's not actually consensus about what people expect or want to happen to this content. I actually, before going into this, expected there to be many more people in this first bar. The other thing that I forgot to make a slide about, but I'll tell you, is that we asked them if they were talking to their partners about this, and mostly no. Over half of people said they had never had a conversation about like careful, secure management of sexting, either before or after breaking up. And of the people who had, it was over 20% of folks who never had that conversation until they had already broken up with someone. So after the point at which the relationship may have been tense, right? Okay, we also asked them what they wanted, what they expected or intended or had most recently done with their own the content that their ex had sent them. And here, over 2/3 of people said that they would intend to delete it. When someone wanted to keep it, they were saying things like, this is meaningful content to me, it's a relationship that I value, and I want to keep some of it so that I can remember the good times. And then we also had a smaller number of people saying, I'm going to keep them just because if the other person wrongs me, if they release them, I can have some sort of leverage against them. So I'll close by just mentioning a couple of like interesting design observations in this space. A lot of the work thinking about minimizing intimate image abuse is thinking about like letting people have further control over their content. And so there are nice features in an increasing number of platforms to unsend photos or messages, or to delete something in a channel, like delete for everyone, which is really great, but not all content, especially in sort of a longer term relationship, is going to end up in a shared channel. So this co-created content, for example, is something that might just be like only on the device of your ex-partner. And so there need to be other ways to maybe negotiate the deletion of that content if this is something important to you. We see that like within relationships, during a relationship when people trust each other, but then also beyond relationships, people are saving this content. Either your relationship never ends and you have 20 years of photos you can look back on, that's great, or you save the ones that you care the most about from your ex from 20 years ago. But either way, like people are storing this over time, which means that they're transferring them between accounts and between devices, and it would be interesting to think about how we're designing for like longer term storage of sensitive content, and whether there are ways to sort of discourage unnecessary storage while also allowing the people who have these long relationships full of like love and laughter and whatever to be able to look back at these photos. Not to have to give them like a higher burden to keep access to something that both parties like having. The last thing I'll call out is that there's some really fabulous research on how people manage digital content generally when they end a relationship. And what this research has found, which didn't look at sexual content specifically, is that it's complicated. If you have content you don't want anymore, it can be like technically difficult to delete everything that you don't want anymore, to be able to see all these, like, to go through every channel you've ever talked to someone that you had maybe a long-term relationship with and get rid of it. And this is sort of heightened in this context, right? If you actually do want to go through and like get rid of the content that your partner had sent you, it's complicated to do so. So thinking about how we can design for simpler sort of separation when relationships end, maybe more, I don't know, mass deletion or something in some contexts could be useful. And what's interesting, like the last thing that I'll highlight that I thought was interesting in this context is that lots of work talks about negotiating consent for like posting things on social media. Like how do you manage social media when you go through a breakup, or you know, maybe not everyone wants this photo shared at a party or whatever. This context is interesting because sometimes people want the content to be deleted even if they don't post it, right? So like someone could be sort of violating the consent of someone by doing absolutely nothing, just by having access to something, even if they don't further distribute it in any sort of malicious way. So there are a ton of interesting design challenges in this space. I'd love to talk to anyone who is interested in thinking through them with me. Yeah, so thank you.
Hi, good morning everyone. So I'm Sergio Pastrana from University Carlos III in Madrid. So today I'm gonna talk, it's a very related talk to research, which is about how people think or how they share their thoughts in times of war. So this is a paper that we have done in collaboration with some good friends and colleagues, and which is being presented now in ICWSM in Buffalo. So the story, we know in February 2022, Russia decided to invade Ukraine. And soon after, the government said that this is not an invasion, it's a special operation. It's going to take just a few weeks, it's going to be something fast. And actually, they started banning words like war, invasion, and things like that in Russian media outlets. What happened is that they started to censor everything, as it happens usually in times of war. So this is what, how all the Western social media news were banned, were not reachable from Russia in the early beginning since the war. So how people reacted to this banning, of course, they want to get informed, so they started to look for alternative channels. So this is a tweet from the anonymous Twitter account that was asking for, okay, go to Google Maps, go to Russia, find a restaurant or a good place and write a review. And in that review, explain to the citizens what's going on. And actually, they were providing examples of what to do and how to reach, the more people the possible, okay? So we decided, the food was great. So we decided to analyze this phenomena, which was not happening only in Google reviews, so to understand whether this was actually happening and how prevalent, what topics were being discussed, and then what was the intent and motivation on how these evolved. Finally, what was the platform's reaction? In order to understand what's the role of these platforms in these kind of situations. So we crawled and collected Google Maps reviews on also TripAdvisor posts from the forums. So in TripAdvisor, people started to do the same in the reviews of places. And soon the administrators said, okay, we're not going to allow that. So if you want to talk about the war, go to the forums and ask or post your information in there, in travel forums. So for the first thing, how prevalent, this is a very similar graph as the previous one we have seen with Twitter. There is a huge peak in just when the war started, because we divided the war-related and non-war-related posts. The way we distinguish between war and non-war is a long story. You might find more details in the paper, but basically we use keyword search and also some sort of machine learning to distinguish between these two. What topics were being discussed? Well, there were some topics that were previously there, like population, geography, economy, but there were some of them that really increased after the war, which was related with political. We saw people discussing about fascism, not only like Russia as a fascist, but also the other way. No, Ukraine, they are Nazis, and so this kind of polarization that we see. Of course, information, violence and insults. There were a lot of hate speech, as we will see later. And finally, war life. Okay, so what was the situation? How is this gonna go, etc. So this was done in a kind of quantitative way using automatic tools, and then we went for the qualitative analysis, understanding, reading and understanding the intents. So the two most expected and things that we showed us to how to spread information or disinformation and how to bypass censorship. So this is one example of a post in TripAdvisor, which says, Putin is lying to you all, do not believe this illusion, ignore your state media, it's not a special operation, it's an assault, innocent civilians are dying, etc., etc. And also how to bypass the censorship. So there were a lot of, not tutorial, but kind of suggestions and advice on how to go, in this case, to Tor browser, or this and another one, how to use an app that will give you a VPN to bypass censorship. So there were a lot of try to helping people, okay, in order to, okay, you want to access information, this is how can you do it. Then we observed that the discussions were turning into more like helping people from within Russia and Ukraine, mostly for humanitarian help. Okay, so if there were a lot of posts raising funds, okay, to help the refugees and setting campaigns in order to help them. Like in this one, a friend is involved in getting orphan kids out of Dnipro. So if you need help, more information like that. Hate speech, people just went there to share their feelings. Okay, like no, don't do that. Russians are fascist, like in this case. There were also some pro-Russian, so there was some kind of polarization, but mostly was on the pro-Ukrainian side. And finally, what it would be expected from Google reviews or travel advice or TripAdvisor forum, which is on travel advice, but not on the sense of tourism, but in the sense of how to get in and out safely. Okay, so there was like, don't use this corridor. Sometimes there are the news that there is a new corridor for refugees, and people were saying, hey, don't use it because you will get bombed, use this one, or there's going to be a bus for free that will take you out or in Russia. There are a lot of people discussing, I have family in Ukraine, I want to go there, or the opposite, I want to go to Russia because my family is there, and things like that. So there were a lot of posts like this. So how platforms reacted? So in general, they didn't like war-related content, but not because it was war-related, but because it was out of the scope of the terms of agreement or the original intent of this. TripAdvisor, they monitored, so we were able to somehow, we had the kind of the telemetry because we were doing daily crawls, so we could know whether a post has been deleted the day after. So just with this timestamp, so if a post was deleted just 1 hour, a few minutes after, we could not get it. But in general, we observed that every 2 days, posts that were not okay for us at the eyes of administrator were removed. In the case of Google Maps, there was something curious at the very beginning because this was getting huge. They decided to disable reviews, so they didn't allow any review on any site in Russia. That lasted for a few days. Then they somehow they reacted the service, but we observed that all of a sudden on March 15, there was a sudden drop, okay, on even non-war related reviews. So many reviews were gone. We ignore why, maybe because they were somehow policing or removing things and they decided to remove those. We ignore the reasons for that. So conclusions, we're in the session on how do people think. I don't know, it's a complex answer as philosophers, psychologists, okay, but we know that they think because they exist and they want to share their thoughts, okay? So in terms of censorship. In this case, we have seen how they look for alternative channels in order to bypass the censorship. So, well, what will happen in others is unclear. So, yeah, thank you very much. I hope we wouldn't be able to do this research because this means that there will not be war, but you have here my contact and a link to the paper. Thank you.
Okay, good morning. My name's Ryan Shandler. I'm from Georgia Tech. I'm going to try and jolt you awake at the end of a long morning session by describing some experiments that are probably more ethically dubious than anything that we've discussed so far during the first day and a half. And frankly, it probably belonged in the deception track yesterday, and you'll tell me at the end whether you think that's right. My background is in political psychology. I used to study the political effects of terrorism and political violence. And what I do is I run experiments that randomly assign subjects to experience different kinds of cyber attacks under strictly controlled experimental conditions in order to see how those experiences shift political attitudes and behaviors and through what psychological mechanism that takes place. But before I share some of the sordid details, I want to explain to you why I think this is a worthwhile pursuit. I teach a class in Georgia Tech. I'm a political scientist, and my brief is to explain to the students and the faculty about the political context in which cybersecurity lives. And in the first class, I asked the students to describe what are the consequences of a cyber attack. We're investing so much effort into creating secure digital systems. What are we worried about? And the answers invariably come across as, we're worried about denial of service, we're worried about the degradation of networks, we're worried about pilfered funds and information, some cyber physical effects. But I argue that this focus on these first-order immediate consequences obscures what we really should be worried about, which are some of the long-term second- and third-order downstream consequences, which can often be far more damaging societally than some tenuous attack which quickly moves on. Now, I teach it, I think about it by comparing this very much to what happens when we think about terrorism. We're far more comfortable thinking when we talk about terrorism, we understand that the effects of terrorism are far more than the rubble and the bodies and the damage and the money. We're comfortable saying that we understand that a terror attack will shift people's political orientation. People will vote more conservative as they seek out security. Threat perception rise. It provokes xenophobia. It sharpens the binary perception of us versus them. And collectively, these long-term consequences can, though not always will, really leave the first-order consequences in the shade. But we don't typically think about this when we think about cyber attacks. Why? Because cyber attacks are less destructive, less viscerally threatening. They don't kill anyone, so people shouldn't experience these same effects. And yet, we know from all of the data that people, probably not in this room, but people are terrified of cyber attacks. They don't understand them, they don't know where they come from, they don't know how to protect themselves, and they get swept up in this wave of cyber doom narratives that percolate throughout the media and pop culture, where they think that every cyber attack is going to lead to the end of the world. So I argue in most of my papers, and I test, that cyber attacks can, on an individual level, cause really severe negative psychological reactions, threat perception, anxiety, fear, and in the long term, it can undermine trust in government, it can cause people to be willing to sacrifice civil liberties for security, it leads to distrust in digital institutions, and these are really problematic. So, how can I experimentally simulate cyber attacks in a way that I can look for causal connections between the experience of a cyber attack and some kind of political outcome in the long term? And how can I do it ethically? So I've come up with a few different solutions. I've been running experiments in this field for years. In one set of experiments, I contracted with a group of media professionals and actors to produce really vivid, seemingly authentic breaking news media segments that describe cyber attacks on critical infrastructure, on energy grid, on water purification plants. I've got about 15 of these videos filmed in different countries with different frames, and I can use this to expose people to the attacks in a way that they are exposed in the real world. Because most people don't get an attack on their computer, they experience it through the media. So I use these quite often. This was an experiment that I ran in Israel where IRB committees are a little bit more lax, where participants were brought in to fill out a survey, and in the middle of filling out a survey, there was a ransomware attack that took place on their computer in real time. So we were able to measure how the experience of the attack that they thought was real was going to influence them in a meaningful way. At the same time, we collected saliva directly after this experience to measure the cortisol in the body as a proxy for stress and anxiety. And so we can really see how do these attacks shift both psychological outcomes and political outcomes. I've run dozens of experiments where I expose people to media coverage of different kinds of cyber attacks with different frames in different countries. And I run natural or quasi-natural experiments where in the aftermath of a major incident, I'll field a survey in the days directly after the attack, testing the difference between subgroups of people surrounding the site who were exposed or not exposed to the attack. So this was after the attack in Dusseldorf in the hospital in 2021. We fielded a survey 3 days after the attack. The black dots are people who were aware of the attack and were exposed. The grey dots were people who weren't exposed. And you can geolocate their location to see their proximity to the attack site. And we can observe differences between these groups. Now, this is usually the point where someone stands up and decides to leave the room out of protest. We take ethics really seriously. We work really closely with ethics boards in all of the countries where we operate. We've got psychologists on the team who help us devise the interventions. We screen people out for trauma. We heavily debrief at the end of every session. We offer counseling, all of these things. But the main argument is that these are attacks that take place in the millions every day. And people are experiencing these negative effects. And to design interventions to actually mitigate some of these harms, we need to understand the precise psychosocial model. And so that's what we're collecting. And we're trying to do it in a way that balances the need for us to collect data with the need to have a duty of care to the participants. So what do we actually find? We find across all of the studies that cyber attacks arouse severe psychological distress, more than you'd expect. Even small, inconsequential cyber attacks that people in this room might dismiss as being beneath our notice, they cause severe distress. They heighten anxiety, they heighten fear. People are terrified of cyber attacks. What you're seeing here is an excerpt from an internal meta-analysis that I ran, which was aggregating the results of about 20 different experiments in 5 countries with 10,000 participants, trying to compare the psychological reactions of people who are exposed to cyber attacks and people who are exposed to conventional political violence or to no violence at all. And we just continuously find that there are really profound negative psychological reactions. The reason I keep talking about psychology is because it's this psychological reaction that triggers a lot of the long-term political effects. That when you experience anger and anxiety and fear, that's what opens the door to shifts in otherwise static political attitudes and behaviors. I find that experiencing a cyber attack reduces trust in government in a really meaningful way. Even these small minor cyber attacks, when people accumulate multiple attacks, they start to feel like the government can't protect them. They start to feel like they need to take matters into their own hand. It sows distrust in digital democratic institutions, in companies that experience cyber attacks, and oftentimes this is going to be the major effect, far more than the money that's stolen in the immediate day. I've got a few surveys that are getting ready to run surrounding the election at the end of this year, whereby we expect that people who are exposed to cyber attacks are going to distrust the results of elections more, because if there are cyber attacks everywhere, then why should we trust the reports that elections are secure? And we find that people are willing to sacrifice civil liberties for security as a function of their exposure to cyber threats. That there's going to be this upstream pressure, this upward pressure from voters who are demanding security, and it's going to be a brave politician or policymaker who's going to focus on privacy when people are demanding at least the appearance of security, which draws back to Bruce's old work. Talk to me if you're interested in these kind of creative methodologies. I'm getting ready to run some longitudinal studies next month. We'll be exposing people to some of these cyber stimuli, and then going back to them after a week and after a month and after 3 months to test both the magnitude and the longevity of these effects. I'm skeptical of a lot of these results and other results that they're an artifact of a controlled survey environment. But I've got reason to believe that the accumulation of multiple cyber attacks at multiple times can trigger this long-term process. Thank you.
Thank you. So the fun part of being right here is that Tony and I were eyeing each other on that one thing that I can't remember if we talked about this several years ago, but we ran an experiment where we did EEG, so we're watching responses to stimuli, and one of the things was we had them on their own laptops doing some tasks, and we fake hacked them with the anonymous mask graphic, and they responded very strongly. And one of them even kind of screamed, right? We were in the control room next door, and they were not happy to be hacked. And again, it was we had to debrief, kind of calm them down. It's traumatic, as you noted there. So what a fun panel! All right, so we're going to go until 10:30. I don't even know where to start. We'll start with Alessandro.
Great panel, great presentations. Richard, what are we really capturing when we're capturing these moral components? Is it the effect of the culture, people grew up in it, the effect of the propaganda, whatever they are, the information they are fed and the framing they are fed, about the conflict in their particular countries? What is the foundation or the moral foundation?
Yeah, I think it's a lot of it's culture. You probably noticed that Americans tend to focus a lot on loyalty, the in-group moral foundation. And I was actually quite surprised at how similar most of the foundations were across different regions. I'm not quite sure what to make of the fact that, Ukraine was actually higher than the U.S. in terms of care. So even though overall the U.S. used more moral language in these 5 areas, Ukraine was higher in terms of care. Well, of course, they're being invaded, so they'd be talking about in the harm aspect of the care, the vice part. But I think it's mostly culture. It's the language that we use to describe. Going into this, I guess when I present this with more time, I sometimes ask people, what do you think, the main foundation will be? And nobody really picks up that it's loyalty and care. Once you see the results, it's kind of obvious. It's like the old experiment on U.S. soldiers in World War II. Who do you think did better, urban soldiers or rural soldiers? And they basically tell people, oh, the rural guys did much better because it's, they're used to the outdoors. Well, that's actually, and everybody says, oh yeah, that makes sense. But then they actually told them the opposite of the result. And so it all seems obvious once you know the result, but I don't think it was obvious. It wasn't to me. We really did not have a strong hypothesis going in as to what would be the main foundations that people use. But I think it's culture, mostly.
Thank you.
Okay, Tyler, and then Alex.
So, Ryan, you're doing these experiments, which is interesting. I'm wondering how this might, what value there could be in corroborating this with people's actual experiences too, to see if it's consistent with your findings. In Tulsa, 2 of the 3 main hospital systems within the past 6 months have experienced ransomware attacks, right? And so I'm always on the local news talking about it or whatever, and people do seem to be genuinely concerned by it. So it seems like it might be interesting to try to do surveys or some kind of follow-up on cases like this, where we have known public big incidents affecting institutions, to see if you get similar sort of longer-term effects consistent with what you're seeing in the surveys.
It's a fair point. I have run some of those natural studies where you intervene immediately after the attack. So the example I gave was the hospital attack in Dusseldorf, where within a week we were collecting survey data and comparing the reactions of people who were near to the hospital, far from the hospital, aware of the attack, unaware of the attack. And we find very much this spike in anxiety and this distrust in the government, this lack of trust in the government's ability to protect them going forward. The difficulty with these it's not a real natural experiment, it's more of an observational exercise, because the subgroups of people who live far and close to the hospital and have more and less awareness is correlated with a lot of other predictors of their trust in government. So it's not a real experiment. The way that we would have to run that is to have preliminary data from some large number of people, and then we lie in waiting for a cyber attack to take place before we can go back to those people and test over the long run. And I've collected the preliminary data of those exercises, and I'm waiting for some cyber attack to take place, and then I'll be able to answer that question more carefully. But yes, I agree that the construct of an artificial experiment isn't ideal, but there's value in identifying causal relations that we can't get just through surveys.
Ryan, thanks very much. That was a really great presentation. I just wanted to suggest that the third order effect that we identified, the trust, like lack of trust in government, might actually be the first order effect for the adversary.
Yeah.
So for those of you that have been like me following like international cybersecurity and diplomacy discussions for the last 15 years, it's kind of obvious that when we have like international cybersecurity discussions, peace and war, China and Russia are actually more interested in internet governance discussions about how to actually control the internet. And half of the problem that we have is every single time there's a cyber incident or every single time there's a major cyber attack that goes global, it advances the narrative for state control of the internet, undermining the ICANN multi-stakeholder model. And therefore, we have constantly tried to push back against this, but we don't really have the data. We know that, for instance, the way exactly the Manichean arts of, for instance, Russian operators use this model. They want that intent, but what we've delivered is actually analysis that it works. So I wrote about this in 2015, 2016 in my book, but I don't actually have the data that shows that what they're trying to do is actually effective. But I also postulate, therefore, is that when we talk about ransomware, I talk about ransomware instead of ransomware. Because since NotPetya and WannaCry, it's been evident that the main intent has always been to spread distrust. And why has been the question. Distrust in what? And I think the end game, which we've seen in many different examples, has always been actually undermining the way the internet works, rather than a more immediate political way. It's a very long-term strategy, but actually, if you look at it, since 1998, we've been saying the same things consistently. Yeah. So congratulations on your work, and I want to catch up with you afterwards.
Thank you.
Thank you. So Bruce, Sunny, Tony, boom.
A question to Allison. You talked about asking people what they would want to happen to images. I'm curious how that changes. What would I wish to have happened in the past, rather than my intentions going forward versus what I wish would have happened?
Yeah, so we asked people whether they had recently gone through a breakup, and then compared answers to people who had recently gone through a breakup versus those who didn't, and there was actually no difference, which I was surprised about. I expected that people would assume that the person that they still love and trust would be fine, but maybe the person that they no longer do would, be less trustworthy. But we actually didn't see a difference in this. Yeah.
It's really interesting.
So a quick follow-up. What percentage had recently gone through a breakup, and what was your age distribution?
The age distribution was between 18 and 65, with like a pretty nice bell curve, so like highest in the 40s. And how many people had gone through a breakup? I think it was 25% in the last 12 months. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you. I also had a couple questions for you, Allison, and we are working on image-based sexual abuse, so we should probably talk after this. But I was wondering if you collected any data about whether or not the images a current or former partner had easily identifiable aspects to them, because that could change what people care about if their face or a tattoo or in an image versus not.
Yeah, that's interesting. We didn't ask people whether they were strategically taking photos to sort of minimize their identifiable features.
Which is one of the types of help people suggest. Yeah. I mean, that's a piece of it.
Yeah. We didn't ask about this. I would guess that, well, I don't know. I don't want to make guesses about this. Because a lot of people were in the context of like trusting romantic relationships, I would expect not all of them were doing this. Sure. We did have someone, so there were like open and closed responses. There were people who said that they would delete photos after a breakup, specifically because they had identifiable features, like that they would prioritize, like if they were to keep any photos, they would make sure that they weren't the ones that had faces or so on.
And then the other question was there any mention of their partner or ex-partner security practices? Because, sometimes the non-consensual sharing isn't because the partner does something untoward, it's because the partner gets hacked.
No one mentioned this. which is interesting. Yeah.
Okay, Tony, Boom, Sadia, Judith.
I have a question for Ryan. Do you have information about the sources of distress? For example, things like the shock of the incident, or the loss of data, or the loss of control over their device, or a sense of violation of their property, or fear? Like cognitive effects versus emotional effects?
Yeah. I don't have data that generalizes across all of the studies because it changes depending on the attack. If it's a ransomware attack on your computer, the level of distress and the foundation of the distress is going to be different than if it's an attack on the energy grid or a water plant or something outside. So the sources are different. Usually it's a creeping dread, so it's a generalized anxiety that isn't targeted towards anything. It's a dread that something bad is coming and I don't know how to protect myself. And oftentimes that's worse than very specific anxiety because you're not sure what exactly is out there. I can talk about specific fears that are related to specific kinds of attack, but I don't have enough data to be able to generalize that and say across every study I've seen that.
I'd like to talk to you about that, because Bonnie and I have done work like this, looking at the difference between emotional fear and cognitive fear.
Yeah.
They're very different, and
Yeah.
measured.
And they've got different effects. So like the language that I use to describe that is threat perception versus negative emotions. And threat perception is more of a cognitive process that you're evaluating the threat that you're facing, whereas negative emotions are just that instinctive first order fear and anger. And I differentiate between them, and they have completely different effects, whether or not you feel one or the other. So we can talk that through and find common language.
I think we're setting up lunch dates here. All right, Boom, Sadia, Judith, Serge.
I also have a question for Ryan. I'm interested in understanding what you think about one, mitigation, but two, also side effect of covering or talking about cyber attacks.
Yeah.
So background is, at least from my understanding, when we talk about disinformation, which is slightly different from cyber attacks, it turns out that disinformation itself may, in some case, have less effect than too much talking about potential disinformation. That creates more distrust in the society than maybe the actual disinformation campaign. So bad actors may just have to try to create disinformation effect to get media and political actors to talk about potential risk of harm. I wonder if in cyber attacks, if you observe that as well, do people, first question is, do people distress proportionate to the kind of cyber attack that you talk about? Do you vary the kind of coverage? Is it when it's more sensationalized for the same, do people have more distress? Do you also try to do things like have coverage where they bring on governments to talk about how they manage to control it? Does that impact if they talk about it before the cyber attack and then cyber attack happens, or only after cyber attack? Things like those, like how do we mitigate this effect or observe that attempt at mitigation actually makes it worse? So that's
I've got lots of answers to that, but I'll give you the one that I find most frequently, which is that cyber attacks are different than disinformation. To mitigate the negative effects of cyber attacks, we need to be talking more about them. So when I showed you that coverage that I looked at people's attitudes when they were closer to the site of the hospital to the attack and further away, we found that people who were closer to the hospital had milder effects. Why? Because they were there. They saw that it was not such a big deal in the end. It wasn't the end of the world. There weren't flames coming from the hospital. The people who were far away, they're imagining cyber doom. They've been watching James Bond and Jason Bourne and reading newspaper articles. They think that it's cyber Armageddon. So the answer has been that when the government comes after an attack and provides more information, that's reducing people's threat perception, because what was going through their head is always way worse than what was happening in reality. And so by talking about it, it's reducing people's harm. I can see why that's the opposite for disinformation, but here it's very much the simplest solution that governments can do to encourage people to deal with this in a positive way. Same with companies.
Sadia.
Yeah, I have a question. You said that at-risk users would rather share their data with big companies than the government. But big companies and government do collaborate. Like, do they understand that government can get the data from the companies anyway?
Yeah, thanks for the question. I think the people that we talked to, it was more a point of the threat model, particular threat model, and then that impacted how they evaluate that question of whom they can actually trust. So the question of trust towards providers is tied to who they are mostly and what their threat model is. I don't think we can say generally, overall, it's either big companies or it's this. It really depends of the capabilities of their adversaries. And if you have a state adversary, then the question is, how does that state adversary relate and can or does cooperate with particular corporations? That is a question that people ask themselves. So, for example, one interviewee from Iran was very clear that there's no problem with using Google because Google and Iran don't get along. It's a little bit different with others then, but I think that is considerations, and I think the threat model here changes.
The next question is for Richard. So we were also doing this analysis of tweets regarding the Ukraine war, and we looked at tweeters and Telegram. And we noticed that the loudest voice about the war are often coming from troll or this organized group that are creating a lot of social media content. So have you noticed that, or did you think?
Yeah, we did not try to identify bots or trolls or things like that.
Okay, so we have Judith and Serge. We'll add Mark and Susan and Andrew.
So my question is for Allison. So I guess clearly one reason people are interested in sharing sexual data is because it's sexy, but another reason is as a bond of trust. And it's basically works as a bond because of the risk. And because it's a dangerous thing to do, if you break up, so it's a way of saying, I know we're not going to break up, or you have to do this to show that you trust me. So is that something you've been able to tease out in your respondents, is the extent to which this should, because anything that you do to mitigate how risky an experience it is, if the people sharing this are doing it for that risk, it's not going to make sense because it undermines that purpose.
That's a really interesting question. One of the challenges I think in this space is that I don't actually think it's possible to eliminate the risk. I think the design space is minimizing and making it harder for low-hanging fruit attacks, basically. And so I'm having a hard time imagining, this is just me speaking personally, not about any of our data, but I'm having a hard time imagining how we could build such a system that it doesn't feel risky anymore.
But she's saying being risky is part of the appeal.
Exactly. So I don't think we can design it away. I think even if we come up with some clever protective mechanisms that help people manage their content in ways that they didn't expect they needed to, the risk would still be there that someone could still show, just hand their phone to someone or take screenshots. Often you can get around.
It's useful to try and tease out those different types of users because some are going to be perhaps just against whatever mitigation you are because it's so against their point. And I guess just the other thing I was going to say is you may well have done this, but look at a lot of the literature about prenuptial agreements because that has a similar dynamic of trying to insert a risk mitigation feature that seems quite anti-romantic. And the issues around conversations with people about being able to discuss this.
Yeah, that's really interesting. So we haven't teased this out, but I would love to talk to you more about your idea with prenuptial agreements. Yeah.
We're inserting Stuart.
Because I just wanted to go in the opposite direction. Because of that extreme, you also have people who, I shared this on Signal, or I shared this you only get to view it once because I'm demonstrating to you how to be safe. And so demonstrating your capability for safety is also something, and signaling your ability that you care about the other person's safety is also something people do. And so
us weirdos do.
Yes. But I mean, reading a lot of dating profiles, a lot of people talk about safety being important to them. And so I think that there's the perfect opportunity because you want to measure that, but you can also measure the exact opposite extreme. It would be a shame to only do one of them and not do both of them at the same time.
This is not, I don't think this is answering your question exactly, but we did take a measure of security posture and tried to see whether that correlated with whether they were saving things, and it didn't.
Okay, Serge.
Also for Allison. Looking at like the questions and the responses, it seems that a lot of the responses would be moderated on whether who's doing the breaking up, right? Whether you're, I guess, the dumper or the dumpee. It seems like a lot of those responses might be kind of contingent on that. Did you ask about that and try and do any analysis to see how that affected the responses?
And did everyone say it was mutual?
Well, like the response about the response about I want them to keep the photos to remember what they're missing. It seems pretty obvious which side that person would have been on.
No, so we didn't capture this, but it would be really interesting. There were some people who commented on this kind of thing, like in their free responses, but we weren't able to test it across different responses. Yeah.
Separately, quick question for Richard. That maybe I'm missing something, but it just seems like any discussion of war inherently would go to loyalty, right? Because like with war, there are multiple factions. Maybe it's I don't understand this. But there are multiple factions, and so it seems like any discussion of the war would loosely, involve in-group dynamics.
I think that seems plausible. Sitting here, we didn't think of it before we looked at the data, but it seems plausible to me.
Okay, Mark.
Thank you. I have like so many questions for this panel, and keep it short. I got to chat Ryan's ear off at dinner last night, so I'm not gonna ask you some questions. Kind of more like comments. Allison, great work, super relevant to a lot of things we do on message history and expectations of privacy. All sorts. One of the things I love about this work is it leads to I've jotted down like 10 at least. How might we sort of design prompts that you could take from these findings. More a comment here that I wanted to mention. Some of the ideas discussed around like negotiating consents or almost like a digital cleanup could be sort of interesting to stimulate some design ideas. Don't know if that's a great idea or a terrible one. The extent to which people want receipts in messaging is really interesting. So we've seen this too, even those who lean into ephemerality quite a bit, wanting digital evidence or leverage, even if there's nothing on the horizon that would warrant that, but just, hey, I'm going to keep it in my back pocket. Saw some of that in your work, so I just wanted to mention that. My other point was for Manila. I don't know if you're doing this, but just something that came to mind because it's something we've seen in our work is to look at the what users expect or the confusions that arise between the interactions between like OS level or device level settings and individual apps. We see a lot of confusions arise there, or users thinking they're setting something at a device or OS level, but actually it's only applicable to a particular app they're using, or vice versa. One of these examples is Messenger has a feature for app lock on not so much a permission setting, but on Android there's also an ability to do that at like an OS level that is not afforded on iOS, for example. So these raise some interesting confusions. Why would I use this feature at an app level versus the device level setting? Just a thought for people.
That sounds good. Thank you.
Okay. Susan and then Andrew.
So, Christian, I'm going to talk to you afterwards. First of all, thank you because you helped set up things for my talk, but we have a lot to talk about, so I'm going to grab the two of you. Thank you. Yiting, I wondered how much you had already talked to people who are doing expert witness and so on, because my experience working, I've been on a gazillion and a half panels with the FBI where they say, oh, so you're Susan Landau. And so on, is that some of them are completely not knowledgeable, but many are really, many of my co-authors have been expert witnesses multiple times, and I would say that these people are very knowledgeable. And for example, Fordham was running under Joel Reidenberg was running loads of meetings for judges and lawyers and prosecutors, educating them for years and years. So I'm wondering, I felt like some of your questions, I know that there are plenty, I was on a panel with an associate director of the FBI who said, did you know that when you use, and I don't remember which peer-to-peer app he was using, that he was describing, that other people's data, data goes on other people's machines? And I thought, God, he didn't get briefed before he did this, did he? So I know that many are not knowledgeable, but many are really incredibly knowledgeable. So I wondered a little bit about your questions.
Yeah, and that's valid. And we did some, I think the issue here is there's not a lot of research to show exactly what the percentages are of lawyers who are knowledgeable. And oftentimes they do learn on a case. Like if they have previously been on a case that involved child pornography or like with a lot of digital evidence, then they do have to like learn it very quickly and become very knowledgeable. But I don't know if that's the case for, let's say, and it might vary by state as well. Some state might have better access to resources, some may not, and then it might also vary between the prosecutors and defense attorney who may
My
be under
experience
resourced.
is that the federal level investigators are at a different scale than the state level investigators.
Yes, so that's where I think I'm interested in, is just kind of establishing some baseline and understanding of what it looks like in the United States, and more specifically, I think looking at Oklahoma's was where I'm at right now, just to working with the lawyers within the state to understand what they need pretty much when it comes to expert witness, because there's different types of digital evidence that requires different types of expertise to analyze some of the data. So that's where a lot of the questions are coming from.
And then, Richard, I had just one quick question for you. Do you distinguish between cyber exploit and cyber attack when you do the studies? Because that when I teach, I find that getting the students to understand that what the newspaper calls an attack is not necessarily an attack is a really important thing for them.
Yeah, I recognize that distinction is important, but I'm more interested in the way that the public perceive it. So if the public doesn't differentiate between those two things, all they experience is a cyber attack. They don't know who's behind it. They don't differentiate between an exploit or an attack or something on infrastructure or something personal. All they get is a sensational media coverage of an attack, even if that's falsely described, and that's what they react to.
So it might be an interesting thing at the end of a survey to say, if this, in the case where it's an exploit rather than an attack, if you understand, now let's talk a little bit about the attack, which is really an exploit. Does that change some of your feelings?
Really interesting. Yeah.
Andrew, with our final brief question.
First, a comment on your previous one. The impact of media, particularly fictional media, is something I work with Bruce on. I'm a film studies scholar, so I'd be very interested to talk to you about looking more into that side of things. But I wonder, a very specific question, what contextual data on prior experience of personal or media coverage of actual attacks did you gather from your participants, if any?
We collected all of it. Their previous history with experiencing cyber attacks, with family and friends who've experienced cyber attacks, their previous experience with conventional political violence and crime and war and deaths in the family and mental health. So we've got all of that background, and that's such a strong predictive factor of whether or not they're going to experience negative effects from cyber attacks. So I'm happy to share that with you later and talk that through.
Great, thanks to our panel. And